Good morning. Welcome to Focus on the News. I'm Senator Dick Black and joined today by John Tigas. Good to have you here, John.
Good to be here.
We've got three topics we're going to go over. First, we have General Minihan. We mentioned him in our last podcast. He's the one that has been widely quoted as saying we're going to war with China in 2 years. And so we'll talk a little about him and what his personnel think of him. Second one, interesting story out of Zero Hedge that the United States is facing a challenge as the petrodollar loses its force. And then the third one, an interesting case that's boiling up in the federal courts where a producer of abortion pills has filed a lawsuit to try to allow them to use their abortion pills to skirt around the Supreme Court's restriction on abortion in the Dobbs case. So anyway, those are issues we will discuss. And John, you want to? I don't know whether you have any thoughts on General Mike Minihan or.
Well, there's something going on with 4-star generals in the Pentagon. You know, I always thought it was kind of a weird place when I worked there, but man, it seems that everyone that if you get a 4th star, it means you're in a different galaxy, because what Minihan is saying and what he's asking of his people is nuts. And even if it was, the only thing that you can really kind of come down to is this is really purposeful, that someone's telling him he should be stirring up potential war with China. And you got the details, sir. Why don't you let folks know what we're talking about?
Well, what's happened is General Mike Minihan predicted we were going to be at war with China in 2025, sent out a memo to all of his subordinate commanders, and he's the head of the Air Mobility Command, and their job is to transport cargo around the world. He, as far as I can tell, he came through the ranks as a transport pilot. Never been in danger in his life, I don't think. You know, maybe he's walked in front of a car or something, but anyway, apparently when he put out this memo, which got picked up by the Republican chairman of the House Foreign Relations Committee, and sort of cited as some idea we might be at war in 2 years, and then we had Mike Pompeo jump on, and he equivocated, but kind of indicated, yeah, this could be the case. But it's important to look at who this guy is that they're relying on. He sent out this memo was truly bizarre. I mean, it just seemed out of, off the planet. And he advised his airmen. He said you need to get out there, fire a clip, and aim for the head. Now he was using that sort of rhetorically, but apparently that didn't go over well with the pilots in the command, and one of them was quoted by military.com as saying, "I'm not aware of a single incident where an aircrew member has shot someone in the head," a C-17 pilot told military.com. His direction completely misses the mark. AMC moves cargo. We're not SEAL Team 6. Well, here's some things he has said. He was at an Air Force Association conference last fall, and he said this, and this is a quote: "When you kill your enemy, every part of your life is better. Your food tastes better. Your marriage is stronger." I mean, I don't know what to say, but then he adds, "We're lethal. We do not apologize for it. The pile of the enemies of the nation's Wait a minute. Wait, let me get this right. The pile of our nation's enemy dead, the pile is the biggest in front of the United States Air Force. And apparently he was shouting all of this stuff during his speech. Now, he delivered a keynote address at the Air and Space Cyber Conference, September 21st of this past year. And he said, this is a quote, "I'm going to speak," not speech, means it's going to come out a little wobbly at times, maybe stutter. I might get some spittle going. Well, I would say it's a sign of the times when the chairman of the House Foreign Relations Committee relies on the opinion of a man who warns of spittle flying from his mouth to set the pace for American policy on war and peace. And I'll say also, and John, you have a little more recent experience than I do, but the character and the intellect of our military senior officers, I'm talking about the top generals, it has declined markedly since President Clinton, Obama, Biden were the ones in charge of molding our military. And I think General Minihan is Exhibit 1. Now, I served as a staff judge advocate in 3 commands, and I was a deputy staff judge advocate in another one in Europe. And in that role, you serve as the personal legal advisor to the commanding general. So that means you don't go through the chief of staff like the rest of the staff do. You want an appointment, you go to see him. Oftentimes you're sort of in an attorney-client relationship with them. So you have a very personal relation. And I've worked with, I don't know, probably a couple dozen of the nation's top generals. And I will tell you, not one of them ever spoke like General Minihan. Minihan sounds more like a character from a Goldie Hawn movie than he does a general, a 4-star general of a major command.
You're going in the Wayback Machine, you may have to let people know who Goldie Hawn is.
Well, that's right. It's been a while, but she made a kind of a funny movie called Private Benjamin. And this is back in the era before we were starting all these wars. There was a lot of comedy about the military, and you know, it was kind of good-hearted. It wasn't nasty or anything. Private Benjamin is kind of a fun story about a woman who it's like everything in her life goes wrong. She's very, very wealthy, but she gets married to this guy. He drops dead on wedding night. She's all depressed, and she does a call into a show, and she says, "Oh, my life is coming apart," and all this stuff. And then some guy calls on the call-in line. He says, "You need to talk to me." He says, "I've got the answers for you." Turns out he's a military recruiter. So she ends up just on a lark, kind of going into the Army. It's kind of a funny movie, but in the course of it, you have this colonel who's in charge of the base, and he turns out to be sort of a lush and or kind of a, you know, tries to physically attack her, and it goes on and on. But anyway, it sort of makes fun of the officer corps. But
that came out, I think, in the late 70s or early 80s at the latest. And it's an interesting thought, actually, you know, as you were talking about it, because I remember when I came on active duty, and maybe I was just naive as a young second lieutenant, but the generals, if you were a general officer, I mean, there was tremendous amount of respect, and
yes.
And there was very, very few people who were general officers that you looked at and you know, this guy's a nut job. I mean, they were very much filtered out, and over the course of years, you know, put in positions. Now, many of them were pretty astute politicians by then as well, in order to advance and particularly to get past 2-star. But they weren't nut jobs. They were highly respected individuals, and many of them had their fingers on moment's notice, attacking the Soviet Union. It was a very distinguished role. And we fast forward, and even under Reagan, it takes years. People don't become a general until probably at least 20 to 30 years in the service. So if we go back 20 years or 25 years, 30 years, what we see was people who were being advanced and promoted under Clinton. There was 8 years, basically the 90s was all Clinton. And then those people by then are sitting as senior lieutenant colonels or colonels in the 2000s. And those folks are being advanced now under a new agenda, and it's the 9/11, post 9/11, war on terror, and it's Bush. And the Bush, I will tell you, the Bush appointees, the ones that we had, I wasn't impressed with. There was so many people, many of them youngsters, like people in their 20s, early 30s, that were in assistant secretary positions. And they were the ones responsible for deciding who was going to, get the check mark and who wasn't. And additionally, the promotion process changed. It became very, very much based around quotas. And we got to have so many women and so many people of this color and so many people of this eye color and everything else.
You say this was under Bush?
Yeah, I was in the Pentagon under Bush, so I had a pretty good look at 3- and 4-star generals rolling through. And I will tell you, at least half of them were excellent, honest people of character. But I saw even then there was some really strange people with very, very openly liberal views on things like diversity and things of that nature. And I think, Bush, as we look back in the rearview mirror, we're going to realize Bush was, he claimed to be a conservative, but his actions certainly dictated otherwise. And I'm not so sure we didn't get infiltrated even under Bush with looking at what actually happened and some of the policies, certainly in DOD and after 9/11. I mean, certainly the whole issue of why we went into Iraq and what we did when we got there and in Afghanistan. There's a lot of questions around how much Bush was directing traffic and how much Cheney was doing things and how much Rumsfeld in particular was running the show, is another thing. But my point is this is something that started 30 years ago.
Yeah.
And those people under the perversion that was Clinton began to get advanced. And we're seeing now nut jobs like Minihan and Milley and even the Secretary of Defense is a former 4-star Army guy who's, a complete nut job. We have incompetence at all levels in the military, and we have to acknowledge that fact. It's going to take another couple decades to cleanse out the military and make it the respected part of the government, the most respected part of government that it once was.
Yeah. Well, if we get a Republican president, he's going to have to go through and absolutely have a purge of the military. They've become quite dangerous in some ways. And recall when we had this essentially a race revolution taking place with the BLM, Antifa, mobs chasing people through the streets, beating them almost to death, assassinating police officers by the dozens, burning places. And the President of the United States, as Commander-in-Chief, has inherent authority to restore order to the United States with or without a federal statute. It is by the nature of being the head of the executive branch that he has that authority. He doesn't rely on some statute. And the military sort of came together and said, hey, look, we're not going to support you. We're not going to allow you to restore order across the United States unless some governor asks you for it. Well, that's baloney. I mean, that's a recipe for collapse of the nation. So the next Republican president who gets into office needs, first of all, he needs to get legal opinions throughout the Judge Advocate General's Corps that will make it very clear well in advance that he has the inherent authority under his duty to maintain domestic tranquility, which is one of the reasons we had the Constitution in the first place. He must maintain domestic tranquility. Congress cannot interfere with his capability to do that. And if the military isn't willing to back him in maintaining law and order on the streets, protecting people from being chased by race mobs, then something is wrong, and we need to get rid of all those people. So,
for you, you're a legal man, and you served in the JAG Corps. For the sake of our audience, do you want to talk? I think it's called posse comitatus or some Latin name like that. Can you explain that, because I think it is probably badly misunderstood in terms of what the president's authority is, and the authority of governors and the Air National Guard and so on. I think it actually would be really helpful.
Well, the Posse Comitatus Act was an act that was passed right after the Civil War, after Reconstruction, which was a very brutal period where Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. He seemed inclined to bring harmony back to the country, but he was out of the picture. You had the radical Republicans at the time who were they just hated the South. And so they imposed this regime on the South where they would not permit Southerners to vote for sheriffs. Well, sheriffs maintained law and order in the South. That's the way it was done. And all of a sudden you had no law and order. So you had the period of the carpetbaggers and the scallywags, where some came down from the north. They were the carpetbaggers, and they came to take advantage of the war widows. You had the scallywags, who were deserters, riffraff, sort of the scum of the earth from the South. And they preyed on the Southerners. Well, anyway, the only law in the South was the Federal Army. And the Federal Army was employed basically to hold Southerners' hands behind them so that they could not restore law and order, and they just fell prey to whatever mobs swept through the South. This actually gave rise to the Ku Klux Klan. That's the reason it rose. It started as a fraternal organization and then became an undercover organization to maintain law and order. But in any event, there was
and it went in a different direction.
Well, yeah, sure, but then you have this. You have the Posse Comitatus, where the Southern states began to reassert themselves, and the idea was that you never wanted the federal government to be employed to carry out the laws within the states, within the United States. And so it places some restrictions on the manner in which the federal troops can be employed. I can't tell you the precise delineations. However, there is nothing that can be done by federal statute that can somehow diminish the president's authority under the U.S. Constitution to maintain law and order. So it's one thing that the Posse Comitatus kept federal troops from being used as sort of the sort of the police force, but that does not prevent the President of the United States from using them as a military force as necessary to temporarily restore law and order in places where it has broken down in his view.
So where does, in the last time I remember, that really happened. Actually, I think it happened actually under the Rodney King riots in LA, but it was actually, in most cases, it's federalizing the National Guard. Is that really what we're talking about here? Basically, the president assumes command as commander in chief of a local National Guard, and then sends them to accomplish whatever it is he needs to have done. Is that
Well,
right?
what happened in LA, and I was deeply involved in this. California National Guard was mobilized. There was what amounted to a race revolution taking place in LA. There were daily reports on the news, almost like they were reporting where the enemy line was today, and the mobs would take over a particular block, a particular street, and it was being broadcast on the radio down there, and it went on for weeks. Well, it had started with the arrest of Rodney King, who went careening through main streets in LA at over 100 miles an hour, just putting everyone's life at risk. When they finally stopped him, they arrested several people with him without incident, but then he resisted, and he's a very, very, very big man, very aggressive and very violent. And in the course of it, they tried to restrain him. He was able to throw people off. Finally, they got the best of him, and they started whacking him with nightsticks so that they could restrain him. All of that was edited down and played on national media to make it look like, oh, some poor guy. They started calling the motorist Rodney King instead of this criminal who was fleeing at over 100 miles an hour. Anyway, so it caused this huge uprising, and the California National Guard was called out. But under their interpretation of the rules of engagement, under the riot control plan, they concluded that they could not use their M16 rifles because the rifle could fire on full automatic, and the riot control plan didn't allow automatic weapons under a very narrow reading. The president activated the 7th Infantry Division. We were in charge of them. I briefed the commander as he was coming through, and he said, the problem I've got, he says, is we're not allowed to use the weapons under the interpretation given by the legal people for the National Guard. And I was familiar with the riot control thing, and I said that was written at a time when individual rifles didn't fire automatic. I said that was not designed for the M16. I said, by the time that you leave here, I'm going to give you a legal opinion under my personal signature that you are not restricted from carrying your M16 rifles into the conflict situation, that was not intended. He said, fine. He says, that's what I needed. He went down that same afternoon. He flew in. He was in charge of a group. It was mostly the 7th Infantry Division and the U.S. Marines. And the rioters were accustomed to being able to thumb their noses at the California National Guard. And all of a sudden, they had 7th Infantry Division, the light fighters, and they had the Marine Corps, and a group of them holed up in one house, and They were surrounded by 7th Infantry Division and the Marines, and they were called to come out, and they fired a shot, and they turned that house into Swiss cheese. Not a person survived that fusillade of gunfire, and all of a sudden the word went out, hey, wait a minute, this is different. This isn't playtime anymore. And
same thing in South Central LA, where the Korean shop owners all got up on top of their buildings and they returned fire. It's amazing what happens when there's a big stick in the room and people get the word. And yet we didn't see that the last go around. And that was actually under, Trump. And like you said, many of his own leaders were fighting against him on being able to restore order. And he was offering to do so and send federal troops, and everybody was like, no, we got this, and yet they didn't. And so here we are, we have a complete lack of real leadership. And we saw it again over the weekend with this balloon incident where a Chinese spy balloon was allowed to just float from Alaska all the way to South Carolina, taking stops to gather intel over missile fields and who knows what else. And yet nothing was done until it was all the way across our country. And supposedly the military was the one saying, no big deal having a spy balloon at low altitude, just sucking up information all at once. Really, really disturbing across the board to see that we have leadership from the White House to the Pentagon to the State Department that really is inhibited from exercising real leadership. And as a result, we have no respect whatsoever. Even, the State Department and the White House has been having a hard time with respect, and certainly Congress even more so for years. But it used to be that the military was the one respected, objective part of our government. And it's just not the case anymore. And idiots like Minihan or whatever his name is, and Millie and others have just torn that apart. No confidence anymore. And for the most part, anyone that's worth a darn doesn't want to be part of a military that's led by people who don't have a straight, I mean that, I guess figuratively and literally, a straight thought in their mind anymore.
yeah.
So, but the other things that we face in terms of challenges is financial. And it had been that the petrodollar and the dollar as the world's reserve was the standard across the world. And that's starting to change for a lot of different reasons. But you've looked into this. The Zero Hedge is a great respected source when it comes to financial perspectives. What's causing this?
Well, what has happened? The petrodollar is one of the foundations of the American financial system. Back in 1945, Franklin Roosevelt cut a deal with the Saudi Arabians, and it worked this way. The Saudis agreed that all of their oil would be transacted in US dollars. And in exchange, the United States agreed to provide defense, complete defense for Saudi Arabia from that day forward. It evolved and it grew to where Saudi Arabia became the head of OPEC, which now meant that all of the OPEC nations had to transact their oil business in US dollars. Meanwhile, the SWIFT system developed, and the SWIFT system was an international banking system where if you have a bank in the United States and a bank in Germany, and there's a trade deal, Germany ships 50 Mercedes-Benz automobiles over here, and the United States, some company in the United States buys them. You have a transaction that takes place through the SWIFT system, and it's all based on US dollars. So between the SWIFT system and the petrodollar, it really is the foundation of the system that allows the United States to run these gargantuan trade deficits and that type of thing, because we just control the whole thing. Well, it's starting to break down, and a lot of it came about because of the NATO's war against Russia, and all of the sanctions and so forth. And so what has happened is that the Saudi Arabians have said, look, we're not going to abide by that old rule of trading in US dollars. We're going to be willing to trade with the Chinese in yuan. And then they've started talking to other countries. Well, we're open to trading oil in local currencies of whichever type. So this impregnable wall of financial dominance has sprung leaks, and it really threatens the bedrock of the financial foundation. And meanwhile, China has agreed with 60 other nations, including Japan, that they're going to conduct trade outside of the US dominated SWIFT system, and they'll just trade in local currencies. And I think a lot of the reason for this is that countries are very nervous, because the United States says, well, we're going to sanction this country or that country. And if you're, Zimbabwe, if you don't obey our sanctions, we're going to punish you. Well, Zimbabwe is a sovereign nation. Albania is a sovereign nation, Kazakhstan. And they say, well, what is this? We've got some foreign country telling us who we can trade with and who we can't. And it's made the world, the countries of the world very, very nervous. And so they're coming up with these alternatives. China and Russia are conducting trade in their own currencies. Russia and India have a deal. Rubles and rupees are exchanged. Russia and Iran. And it's not that we aren't still the, king dollar. The dollar is a very big deal, but we've kind of frittered away our financial respect by the over-reliance on sanctions, the push towards global warfare, unbridled deficit spending, and it made the countries extremely nervous when the Western banks, U.S., London banks, just seized about $1/3 trillion in it was the Russian National Bank that Russia had entrusted to us. And all of a sudden we said, well, it was yours yesterday, it's now ours. That's a great banking system.
Yeah, it's actual thievery, disguised as some sort of, international political solution, but it really is. And I think, there's a lot of folks who are, business people in Russia that are like, hey, I just happen to be Russian. I'm not, participating in the war. Why are you seizing my account? And you can't blame them for wanting to find an independent way to not have to rely upon U.S. banks. And that's exactly what they're doing. And because they have close ties to India and Iran and other places, India and China are two largest population countries in the world. There's a lot of money there. So we are seeing, that I think the other thing that people it's hard to understand is that we've been able to get away with printing more dollars and have less impact on the inflation because the rest of the world actually shares in our inflation when they have their money traded in dollars. When we get to the point that we're the only folks using dollars anymore, that impact is much greater. And we're certainly, on the individual level, in addition to the fact that we see this on a national and international level, but on an individual level, people are doing the same things. People have seen that the banks will seize individual accounts like they did with the trucker convoy issue in Canada. And more people are being recommended to get your money out of, federal banking system and get it into a local bank, or maybe going as far as transferring that money into something other than what can be kept in a bank, gold, silver, Bitcoin, because people no longer trust the financial system of the United States. Ultimately an economy is built on trust, and people no longer trust the United States. They no longer trust it as a international peacekeeper, because we're not. We're actually infuriating conflict in many cases. And we talked earlier how we had generals that are just, will-nil, just talking about having wars with other countries. We're encouraging war right now in Ukraine and Russia instead of trying to solve the problem. And we're seeing all sorts of wars and rumors of wars all over the rest of the world. And it's not leading to confidence in the United States. The nation that was the world's police force has become one that is causing conflict and confusion all over the place. And that includes the financial system, and ultimately is reflected in the financial system. And we're not going to be a great nation if we're not a great financially independent and stable economy. And so it's a scary place that we see ourselves in, and it's going to take a lot of time and better policies and consistent policies of peace and prosperity to change that. But we are at the end of our time slot for today. Any final words for our studio audience?
No, I think this is a good time. We were going to discuss the situation with the abortion pills, but maybe we'll pick that up on Wednesday. So thank you all for being with us. This has been Focus on the News. We will see you at 11 o'clock on Wednesday.